So I'm doing my best Father Hawley impression today because I am out visiting my parents in Florida, and so I feel like I'm giving a sort of a sermon from somewhere interesting instead of my usual cluttered office. This morning's readings we get a couple of passages, but I want to focus on Acts of the Apostles, where we learn about that it's in Antioch is where this early Jesus movement is where they first start getting called Christians. And I want to think a little bit with us about, well, what does it mean to be called Christian? What does it mean to be Christian? So what this makes me think of, so a few years back, I was in Jerusalem. I got this tattoo, see, of a Jerusalem cross. It can represent a bunch of things. It can represent the four corners of the city. It can represent the four gospels. It can represent the 5 wounds of Christ. But I got it at a Palestinian Christian tattoo artist whose family has been doing tattoos for pilgrims, especially from parts of the world like Armenian and Ethiopian and Egyptian Christians who get a tattoo to show that they've been on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. His family's been doing tattoos from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre for centuries. And for me, ever since I've gotten this tattoo, I mean, it's pretty prominent, I feel like a lot of my spiritual life has been trying and failing and trying again to live up to this claim on my body of being a Christian. It's a way for me of making very permanent and very visible the claim of my baptism, of trying and failing and trying again to reject sin and to live in the freedom of the children of God. And that makes me think about what it means for us as a community to continue to be called Christians. The term was probably a term of abuse before it was a term that people claimed. It probably was a way of making fun of them. But they took it and they ran with it. And they decided this is part of their identity. And it raises the question, well, how would people know that you're a Christian? Is it by a tattoo? Is it by a jewelry? Is it by your actions? Is it by your deeds? And that's really where it hits the fan, right? It's one thing to get a nice cross tattoo. It's another thing to figure out how to live a Christian life. And that's much harder. But also, we trust in the grace of the Holy Spirit to allow us to do it if we're open to God's movements. Now, some of you know that my day-to-day research and work, I think a lot about what the church is. And so one of the things that's interesting here is that the community as a whole is the group that's being named by their actions. How do we know? How would Holy Trinity Parish know? How would the Catholic Church in the Washington, D.C. area know? How do people know whether or not to call us Christian? Some of you may be old enough to remember some of the experimental music of the 1970s in the Catholic Church, and that they will know that we are Christians by our love. It's a little before my time, but not entirely. And it comes from elsewhere that the commentary on the Christians is see how they love one another. How well do we love one another? It's a hard time in the Catholic Church, and it's a hard time as people living in the United States to ask that question about how will people recognize us as disciples of Christ? Is it by our love for each other? Is it by our patience with each other within the church? Is it by our love and patience for each other in our world, in our divided political life, in our increasingly polarized country? How are we as Catholics called to be recognizably Christian by our love? By both the stuff we're supposed to hide so that our Father who sees in secret knows what we have done in secret, but also through our more public acts of witness. The very fact that we keep gathering together every week and trying, I would argue, is one of the best ways that we can continue to show that we're trying. One of the best ways that we continue to show for ourselves and for anyone who's watching our hope in a world made new, our hope in a world that's been healed, and a humanity whose divisions have been healed. I mean, the church is supposed to be, you'll notice that Antioch's community is an interestingly divided community. It's one of the communities where you have ethnically Jewish Christians and ethnically pagan or Greek Christians banding together. The original unity of the church was not a unity of people who all looked the same, acted the same, thought the same. It was a fragile act of communion between people who were trying to stay together at a table every week, despite their differences in background, despite their differences in food. When you read Paul and Peter and James, despite their real theological differences, their love for each other was what kept them together. Their love for each other was not exercised just by saying nice things or writing nice letters, but by showing up week after week after week. That's a model that we as Catholics might be able to offer, however flawed, however failed at times, however haphazardly, but a model of living together and loving together that might be a message of hope for a world that's increasingly divided, a world where old identities and new loyalties are always competing for our loyalty over and against the loyalties of our baptism. So, as I'm happily sitting here in sunshine in Florida, I'm thinking a lot about how would people know that you are a Christian? How would people know that we are Christians? And how do we both celebrate the ways in which we are already doing that, because those are real, and ask for further conversion to better walk that path to be more recognizably Christian?